Okay, welcome everyone to the webinar today. I'm Paul Hallett. I'm president of the British Society of Soil Science, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what is now our seventh webinar of the year. So just before I've introduced the presenters, I just want to introduce the British Society of Soil Science, and we are the hosts of the webinar today. So we're an international membership organization. We actually have members from 40 countries, and we're a charity committed to the study of soil in its widest aspects. So we bring together quite a wide group of people, not only people within academia, but there's a growing body of people who are practitioners. And you're going to see some of that today, where we're implementing soil science in industry as well and ensuring that best practice is used. We also have members just with a keen interest in soils as well. So we're 10 webinars are planned for 2025. So keep an eye on our website. You'll see further details of upcoming webinars that we have. So just before we begin, some basic housekeeping. So there are a lot of you here today, over 100 people. So all your microphones are muted. We're taking questions at the end of the presentations, but what you can do throughout the webinar is click on the question button and type in whatever question you have. We'll collate them at the end and then pose the questions to the speakers after both talks are finished. The other thing that we will be offering today are bases and NROSO CPD points. So if you're registered with either body, please contact us directly and we can have that registered. And also be aware that we're recording the presentation as well. So this is a webinar that's being done in partnership with one of our corporate members, and that's Arcadis. So Arcadis is the world's leading company delivering sustainable design, engineering, and consulting solutions for natural and built assets with more than 36,000 people in over 30 countries. So it's an incredibly large organization. Sustainability is at the heart of everything that they do, and the focus is to maximize their impact to improve the quality of life. And that feeds in quite nicely to the first presenters because they're from Arcadis. Both of them will be well known to members of the society. So they're Bruce Lascelles and Jess Potts from Arcadis. So Dr. Bruce Lascelles is a chartered soil and environmental scientist. He has 35 years of technical and business management expertise. He's currently the UK Director of Sustainable Land Management at Arcadis, but many of you will also know him as the past president of the British Society of Soil Science. And he's also the president-elect of the International Union of Soil Science. So he's really brought in the international component from our society. He's joined by Dr. Jess Potts. Jess was really active in our early careers committee as well. So another great supporter of British Society of Soil Science. She's a senior soil consultant at Arcadis. She's got a passion for connecting science with practical solutions, and her background spans consultancy, site work, and client engagement on complex infrastructure and environmental projects across the UK. So I'll pass over to Bruce and Jess. They'll be followed by a talk by John Quinton and Jess Davies, who I'll introduce later.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. I'll just wait for the slides to come on. Here we go. Brilliant. So yeah, so we're going to be covering soils in planning and construction today. So very topical, and we really want to look at kind of where we are and where we need to be. And we're actually going to start with the construction side of things first, because I think this really provides the context for why we need change and a much greater emphasis on soils during both the planning stages and the build stages of projects. And I'll got some slides first, and I'll hand over to Jess to give some real world examples of how soils are or maybe are not considered and managed on site. But I just want to sort of introduce it first of all, perhaps with some sort of context around why it's absolutely sort of critical that we do get this right. So if you can go to the next slide, Jess. Unfortunately, to sort of start talking about this, we need to recognise the problem that our soils and therefore that we face in relation to this. And development continues to take new land and continues apace. And the stats from the sort of the latest information I can find for the 3 years between 2019 and 2022, nearly 50,000 of hectares of non-developed land was developed. And you can see from the graphic there that this is coming from land, predominantly previously used for agricultural, forestry, and so on. So, we're losing land, but also on top of that, it's recognised that our land and soils are under pressure everywhere. So we've got large expanses of land which are deemed to be degraded. large areas deemed to be at risk of erosion and therefore further degradation, for example. So we've got all this going on. Then on top of this, we've got the fact that large volumes of soil are going to landfill, which is probably underlined by, I think, how soils are viewed. We still hear quite often the term muck shift used to describe soil movements on construction sites. And I think if this is how we refer to this valuable resource, it's perhaps not a surprise that we're not taking due care of it. And I'll touch on in a moment on what soils provide us with, but it's no bad thing sometimes for the monetary cost on this. And in 2016, soil degradation and loss was calculated to cost us about 1.2 billion every year. And I think that's a really, really sobering thought. And it isn't just a historical problem, it is ongoing, and we're not at a place yet where we've resolved everything. And this is all happening, and if you can go to the next slide, Jess, despite the fact that we know soils are a critical part of our life support system. So we should be valuing it alongside how we value biodiversity, air, and water. And our highly variable soils provide this sort of range of functions which support the delivery of ecosystem services and ultimately the delivery of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I won't linger on this, there have been other talks around this, but I love this concept, which I've taken from Professor Lau, of the soil life nexus, although I think it originally comes from Charles Kellogg from the US in the 1930s. And it's, without soil, there can be no life, and without life, there can be no soil. And I think that really kind of exemplifies for me, we've got to get better at communicating the story of soil to all sorts of audiences, to move us to a point where much more thought and much more care is taken. If you go to the next slide, but it's not all doom and gloom. Soils, we are seeing things change, and soils are continuing to move up the agenda. And I just sort of went back to the World Soil Charter, which we have, which was revised in 2015. And this highlights the role of soils as being integral to ecosystems and that key phrase, human well-being. It also kind of sort of highlights the fact that we need to come together across multiple disciplines and with multiple stakeholders to solve the problems. And soils are complex, and the users of soils are complex. And so we've really got to get that right. And if you go on to the next slide, that there are drivers for change. And again, I haven't got time to sort of go through everything here, but we've got things like the 25-year environment plan. We've got relatively recent acts of parliament and schemes like ELMS. And if you go to the next slide, those are being sort of built upon. So we've got the environment improvement plan, which I did do a count. It mentions soil 69 times, which doesn't feel like it's enough or a lot, but it stands out in where soil has been previously. And as well as looking at agricultural soils, there is this specific reference to preventing soil resources being sent to landfill, and that's really good to see, particularly given the amounts that are going to landfill. But I think we also really need to recognise that a soil reuse and storage depot scheme is only part of the answer, and hopefully only a small part of the answer to the problem that we face. We really need soils and soil reuse to be thought about and planned for from the very outset of projects, and not simply dealt with at the end when you've got a surplus of soil visible in the stockpile, but all opportunities for on-site reuse or even off-site reuse have gone. And then if you go to the next slide, we've also then at the start of this year had the consultation on the land use framework, and we'll wait to see what's published in the sort of the actual final framework, hopefully later this year, which is what DEFRA have committed to. But again, I just put this up because it provides that clear direction that the health and functioning of our land, and therefore the soil which underpins it, is critical. The land and the soil can provide us with so much. But what I think is really important from here is this reference to the people who work on or look after the land have been, and I would add, and therefore will be, pivotal to a sustainable future. And then you can layer over this the sort of the guidance. So if you go to the next slide, we've got this growing suite of guidance from guidance around soil surveying and sampling, guidance on sources of information, through to particularly important and relevant for this conversation, construction phase guidance. So we've got the DEFRA code, and that is in revision. We don't believe it will be the revised version will be published probably until next year, maybe. But that is sits there and is a really core document. We've got guidance from the Institute of Quarrying on soil handling. We've got the Syria Soil Community Practice web resources available, guidance from BS on soil management in development and construction, the Soils and Stones report from the Society of Environment, and outputs from the Soils and Planning and Construction Task Force, which you'll hear more about in the second part. So lots of outputs, lots of people saying the same things, the same sort of message. And also then in that sort of planning part of it, we've got this relatively recent guidance from IEMA around how to go about assessing soils and land within environmental impact assessments. And so that feels all really, really positive, but we need the right expertise alongside that. So if you go to the next slide, I think there's a real growing recognition of the skills that are required to deliver effective advice on soil handling. And there's some great guidance available from BS on the competencies required. So both in terms of sort of foundation skills, but also in relation to specific soil related activities. But there is a real skills gap here, and we're only going to see increased pressure on resources as that pace of development picks up with sort of changes in government direction and policy. So it was really good to see BS host a discussion on this skills gap at the recent Natural England conference, and hopefully there'll be some really positive next steps as a result of that. So if you go to the next slide, Jess, there is lots to be really positive about in this space, and there are some really great examples of good practice and of innovation, but alongside that, there are too many examples of where soils have not been considered beyond perhaps that muck shift terminology. And just before the webinar started, it's interesting to hear from Paul in terms of what he's just seen in his local area. And so what we really need is the kind of policy, the guidance, the skills, so that soils can be considered at every stage of a project. And we've tried to kind of set this out broadly against the REBA plan of work stages, which you can see there, 0 to 7 on the top of the screen there. And if everything that's on that slide was done, that would be ideal. And if everything was done defined by a clear soil strategy, that there was good sequencing of activities and transfer of knowledge as a site moves through, or a project moves through the various stages. Because the alternative, which again, unfortunately, too often happens, is where that importance of soils is only recognised when the project is in use, but it's actually then failing to deliver on expertise that, gardens are brown, gardens are flooded, land isn't functioning, soils running off and washing off into drains and blocking drains, and all those sorts of things. And we've got to bring that thinking right the way back to that start of a project, and build from that. And I haven't had time to go into sort of the various national policies in place across the devolved nations, and we'll hear more about local policies again in the second half. And again, whilst they are useful, very often they're applied to get a project from one stage to the next, and then the focus moves on and the thinking about soil stops, and suddenly again you're behind the curve in terms of getting it right and having that truly sustainable soil management. So having a soil strategy, thinking about soils all the way through a project is needed, and we need the policy to really kind of drive that forward, both carrot and stick, I think, as well. So I'll leave it there, and I'll hand over to Jess now for some to go through some examples.
All right. Yep. So thank you, Bruce. So Bruce has introduced kind of the policy and the guidance and set the stage for good soil management, from early planning right through to aftercare, and what it's like in reality, and what we face on the ground can sometimes be in juxtaposition to this. So these here are some of the most common issues that we can come across on construction sites, from soil stockpiles with limited space leading potentially to soil mixing, rutting and compaction from working in wet weather, or no baseline data to guide management or reuse strategies. And these problems don't just affect the soils. They delay programs, increase costs, and directly impact things like biodiversity targets, landscape success, and even on-site health and safety. So what are we doing? Across planning, construction, and aftercare, we're advocating for embedding early soil thinking, making sure soil surveys are carried out where the information feeds into habitat and landscape designs, and realistic reuse plans are developed. During delivery, we're supporting training, monitoring, and coordination across disciplines, so soils aren't just treated in isolation. And in aftercare, we focus on measuring outcomes and adjusting management to ensure long-term success, whether that's for B&G, landscape quality, or soil function. And now that we're looking at kind of some of these common issues and how we aim to address them, we can move on to look at a few case studies that bring these into kind of real life on real projects, showing both the lessons learned and the values of getting it right. So the first case study we want to look at focuses on where there was actually very limited topsoil and subsoil resources available to support the planned planting plans. So a soil creation approach was developed to reuse site-one materials for the habitat delivery. So on this project, there simply wasn't enough topsoil or subsoil available on the site to meet the requirements for the proposed woodland and grassland habitats. However, the site did have large volumes of overburden and other suitable soil-forming materials that had the potential to be repurposed. And because we were involved early, we were able to work with a team to develop a bespoke soil creation strategy. This started with defining a material acceptance criteria, so what could and what couldn't be used, and also looking at the incorporation of PAS 100 compost to boost both organic matter and soil structure. We designed different soil blends to suit each habitat type, such as woodland or species-rich grassland, with careful consideration for drainage, fertility, and the required profile depths. This approach enabled 100% reuse of these site-one materials and avoided the need to import or dispose of soils, but also required very close collaboration with the contractor, adjusting the method as the program evolved and making sure the materials were handled and placed in a way that actually delivered the right soil function. And this is a strong example of how we can get more from the materials already available on site, but only with early planning, clear criteria, and an agile collaborative delivery team. So moving on to a second case study. Here we're wanting to look at how soil considerations can be integrated from the outset of a development, right at that master planning stage. Here we are brought in early again to assess the site's soils, and not purely from an impact assessment approach, but also in terms of their ongoing value for food growing, gardens, landscaping, and biodiversity. This information was then used to develop a soil strategy, submitted alongside the planning application, which would set out how different soil types could be retained, reused, or enhanced depending on their suitability for specific functions. All about getting the right soil in the right place. Crucially, this meant that soils were influencing these decisions from the beginning. From building levels to drainage and open space design, it meant that conversations about soils weren't reactive, they were instead shaping layout choices and long-term functions. And also, for example, the developers gained a better understanding of soil management and why it matters. Foundation levels were adjusted to allow for proper soil profiles for the gardens, and nutrient-poor topsoils were set aside specifically for creating species-rich grassland. This shows what's possible when soil is treated as a core design input rather than just a material to move around. And it's the kind of joined-up approach that we need to see more of if we're going to be able to hit our wider sustainability, B&G, and climate resilience targets. And our third case study takes us to another major infrastructure scheme, where actually we were brought in quite late in the process to help solve a soil-related challenge. So here, as part of the approved landscape design, there are extensive areas of species-rich grassland required to meet the biodiversity and planting commitments, but the site itself was formerly agricultural and the soils were high in nutrients, making them unsuitable for this kind of low-fertility habitat. That left the project with over 15,000 cubic metres of nutrient-rich topsoil that technically, in that state, couldn't be reused for its intended purpose. The default option might have been off-site disposal, but to their credit, the contractor and client wanted to find a much more sustainable solution. We carried out detailed assessments of the Site 1 topsoil and subsoil, both individually and in various mixing ratios, to see how the soils could be blended or reconditioned to create something more suitable. Through this approach, we were able to retain a significant volume of the materials on site, reduce waste, and align the soil characteristics with the biodiversity aims of the scheme. And whilst in the ideal world, we would have all planting matched already to what soil resources occur prior to the works being undertaken, this approach does show that with the right expertise and willingness, we can make positive, resource-efficient choices even later on in the programme. So moving on just from our case studies, we've also got some lessons learned. So looking at some wider scenarios that we may see across various platforms and various programmes. So the image here shows severe rutting in a newly planted area where clearly there's been a lot of investment into getting those trees in the ground. But what we're seeing here is unfortunately a common issue: soil damage from inappropriate vehicle access, likely the result of wheeled vehicles repeatedly tracking across the site during or shortly after wet weather. And this can happen at all stages of a project, from early access, fencing contractors, landscaping aftercare, or during the depth of construction. Even a low number of passes can cause serious issues when the soil isn't dry enough. But the problem here isn't just the poor weather or the unsuitable ground conditions, it can also be poor coordination. And whilst these impacts are often wholly unintentional, there are ways to attempt to prevent it from happening in the first place. Soil management plans are often in place, but unless those plans are communicated and followed by everyone on site, they unfortunately just become documents sitting on a shelf. This kind of rutting damages soil structure, affects future planting establishment, and can even delay in the practical programme completion. As once that structure is gone, recovery can take years and poses a real risk of breaching planning conditions if soils are earmarked for reuse or restoration. And not all soil damage can be immediately obvious from the surface. The image here on the left shows where subsurface compaction has been assessed, with signs of compaction likely as a result of repeated trafficking in wet conditions, but in this case, this was identified and remediated by the contractor. This highlights the importance of ongoing soil assessments on site, not just relying purely on surface visuals, though compaction like this could have telltale signs, likely including water pooling and potential drainage issues across the site. This also shows how the collaborative approaches between contractors and consultants can lead to good outcomes. Soil protection isn't just about prevention, it's also about recognising when the damage has occurred and having the tools and knowledge and coordination in place to put it right. So having looked at what can go wrong, we can also turn to some positive examples. These next slides show how good soil management on construction sites can and does work when it's properly planned, communicated and implemented. So on the left, we've got a really clear example of good topsoil and subsoil separation. This is a fundamental principle of soil handling, but one that can get overlooked or easily muddled on active sites. Here you can see how the soils have been stripped, stored separately and signposted, making it easy for everyone on the site to understand what material they're dealing with. And this kind of clarity prevents cross-contamination, preserves soil structure and fertility, and lays the groundwork for successful reuse later on in the programme. And on the right, we're seeing supervised macro-turfing in a high-value ecological habitat. This is a great example of careful, low-impact handling of sensitive soils and vegetation, overseen by a trained specialist. Coordination between the plant operator and the specialist here is key. The machine's doing the heavy work, but the outcome is being guided in real time. It shows what is possible when technical specialists are embedded into the process, not just brought in at the end. Training, clear roles and expectations, and proactive communication on sites mean better outcomes with less risk of needing to redo the work at a later date. So what does good soil practice in planning and construction really look like in 2025 and beyond? We've looked at some of the common challenges: compaction, rutting, poor coordination, and we've seen how these can still happen even with the best plans in place. We've also shown that when a soil is treated as a valued asset and not a waste or an inconvenience, and when guidance is properly applied, we get genuinely better outcomes for projects, for people, and for the environment. By investing early in soil investigation, embedding good practice through training and supervision, and aligning soil strategies with the wider goals of a scheme, like habitat delivery, sustainable drainage, or productive landscapes, we can avoid unnecessary waste and make the most of what's already on site. We are starting to see momentum building. Policy drivers are catching up, new guidance is in place, and there's more and more recognition than ever that soils can underpin the long-term success of projects. But to move from good intentions to consistent delivery, we need that joined-up approach. That means clear roles, contractual accountability, site-level communication, and practical tools and knowledge that can be embedded into our workflows. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Jess and Bruce. That was absolutely fascinating. I think another take home from that is that if people employ highly skilled soil scientists, they can get quite a lot of positive input to building and industry work as well. So thanks very much for the talk. Just a reminder that questions are going to be taken at the end of the second presentation that's about to start now. So if you have a question, please put it into the question box by 12:50 when we'll start the questions and answers. So we now have two other speakers. They're Jess Davies and John Quinton, and they're both from Lancaster University. So Jess Davies is Professor of Sustainability at Lancaster University. She's an engineer and an environmental scientist interested in the role of land and soils in creating sustainable food, climate, and water futures. John Quinton is Professor of Soil Science at Lancaster University. So he's spent about the last 30 years working on understanding and predicting soil erosion processes and how they degrade soil functions, the link of this to soil monitoring, and how we can protect soils better, and how soils can be managed to mitigate flooding and the pollution of surface waters. So I'll now hand over to Jess and John.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to share the screen, hopefully. Great, thanks. And thanks to BSSS for hosting this webinar and inviting us to speak. In the next 20 minutes or so, we want to share with you one of our latest projects that's focused on local planning policy for sustainable soils that we call the Local Soils Project for short. This project was co-led by myself and a colleague at Lancaster University, Miriam Calvo, who's in the School of Architecture. So she brings a very different, valuable perspective to the project. And John's really key part of the project as well, and he's here and he's going to talk a bit later. Our local authority partners at Lancaster City Council and Cornwall Council were also part of the core team, so a really big thank you to them. And we just at the outset would like to say thank you to all the people that contributed to the project, around 60 people across policy and industry. Some of you are in the room today. Contributed your valuable time and insight, and we're so grateful for that. And yeah, hopefully it's brought us to a really useful output. So we're just going to share with you today some of the motivations and aims of the project, what we did, what our key finding was, and then I'm going to pass on to John, who's going to tell you more about the main output of the project, which is this local soils model policy, which is available on our website now if you'd like to download it. So this work arose from the Soils in Planning and Construction Task Force, which Bruce mentioned a little bit earlier. This is a cross-sector grouping that me and John helped found, along with master planners, landscape architects, local authorities and other industry experts. We aim to be a cross-sector voice that champions soil sustainability in building a sustainable built environment. We seek to set out more ambitious principles for how to incorporate soil sustainability into planning and construction and support the adoption of those. So this work in the Local Soils Project is definitely in that third point in supporting adoption of soil sustainability and in the local planning context. So why do soils deserve more attention in local planning? Bruce has already and Jess have talked about this a lot, the problems that we encounter during development. And Bruce mentioned as well, the masses of soils that are being sent to landfill in England and more widely in the UK. But these are big volumes of soils that are being sent to our landfills, and perhaps more. The amount that's going to landfill in England is in the order of 10 times more than's being lost from agricultural fields in England and Wales from soil erosion. So these are big volumes of our precious resource to be losing, and also then we also have all the damages that are on site, some of which Jess has highlighted. We tried to bring together some of the science around this, review what was out there in terms of what we know about the soil damage during construction, and that's summarised in one of our reports on our website, the Building on Soil Sustainability report, if you're interested in that. But why focus in local planning then? Well, we would argue local planning policy is a really powerful intervention point for influencing the whole development process. So it's the very start of the construction process. So considering soils from that first stage means that we have the best opportunity to protect and promote good soil management. And policy at this stage provides certainty. The development industry is having some certainty about how to treat soils throughout the entire development process is useful. We need clear guidance. There's lots of guidance out there, great guidance, but it's fragmented across the landscape, and a lot of it is voluntary. So providing policy in the local planning arena provides that certainty. And ultimately, better integration of soils in planning policy can deliver multiple benefits and multiple beneficiaries. So it helps the local authorities in delivering their priorities around climate resilience and climate mitigation. It helps our natural environment itself, helps broader government and regulators deliver policy priorities, but also water companies in achieving their goals. We've heard from Jess, that it can help with health and safety issues, operational benefits for developers and contractors, and ultimately we're just trying to deliver healthier, happier places to live and work for residents and communities. But what does good look like? How do we embed soil sustainability in a local plan? This is something we wanted to explore in the project. So we wanted to collaboratively explore how to embed soil sustainability into a local planning policy, engaging lots of different experts to make sure what we did was effective and feasible. So we co-developed a model policy for Lancaster City Council and Cornwall Council. So this is like a template that's going to slot into their policies, but could be used elsewhere in other local authorities as well. We did this through a series of engagements, so online focus groups, in-person policy co-design workshops that delivered this model policy and guide at the end. We also have a more detailed technical accompanying report that's going to be released soon. It's just having sign off through our partners. So in the focus groups, we engaged 25 participants across a range of different organisations, and we wanted these sessions to inform the design of our in-person activities, our in-person policy co-design workshops. In the focus groups, we explored 4 key questions on what are the strengths and gaps in understanding of soil benefits and impacts, which soil functions are a priority for stakeholders, what are the perceived barriers and enabling mechanisms, and who else do we need to be talking to. We hosted these online, and we used Miro boards to facilitate the discussion and record people's input into the discussion. So all the oral contributions and written contributions were gathered together and analysed. So my colleague Miriam led this aspect of it, and I'm not going to say much about it because she's the expert, but basically a social science approach of grounded theory analysis was taken to analysing all those contributions. And what did we find then with respect to the questions that we had? So in terms of the strengths and gaps in understanding of soil benefits and impacts, the participants we had a really wide awareness of the benefits that soils provide and the impacts that are occurring during urban development. But the degree to which soils were of benefit or impacted was sometimes surprising for them. This was a very informed group of people, though, self-selected, people who wanted to spend time online talking about soils. May not be the most typical for the industry, and so our participants felt that there was definitely a need for clear, concise, well-evidenced resources to communicate benefits and impacts help raise awareness across the sector. With respect to question 2, which soil functions are a priority, our participants had a really wide range of priorities. Carbon storage, nutrient cycling, water management and biodiversity were most frequently flagged. But our key takeaway here really was we need to avoid prioritising and managing for one function only. These policies need to address the multifunctionality of soils. With respect to question 3, which was around perceived barriers and potential enabling mechanisms, a lot of barriers were identified throughout the whole process. So we looked across the REBA plan of work and there were barriers at every stage, basically. And we found that conversations tend to draw towards soil reuse and waste management. And I think that reflects the significant challenges that there are in that area, but also the degree of awareness of soil loss compared to other soil damages. And so one of the key things we took away from this was that we need to be careful to also consider the sustainable management of soils in situ. So we took these key takeaways into the development of a set of activities to co-design this model policy. So my colleague Miriam is an expert in participatory design. She came up with these great activities that were around bowl games and policy posters that helped us generate vision statements for the policies, the policies' contents and the beneficiaries. So we ran 2 workshops with 39 participants, and we focused around 3 key policy areas, again, based on the learning from the focus groups. So we had 3 areas around soils for natural environment, capturing things like soils' role in climate regulation and biodiversity, soils for water, speaking to flood risk, water quality issues, and soils as a resource, tackling that, valuing soils as a resource and not leading to them being classed as a waste. So some of the key findings from those workshops. So participants felt that addressing soils at the pre-design stage is crucial. So you heard Jess talk about master planning, how important that can be. But that needs to be continued by a thread of continued management and monitoring that goes through the whole process. Participants identified several opportunities to integrate soil sustainability into existing processes and policies, but not all actions had a natural place to sit already. So we might need some standalone policy as well. The need for community engagement, because they're going to be the custodians of the soil in the longer term, and collaboration between agencies as we move throughout the plan of work was also flagged as really important. And this idea of a soil sustainability hierarchy, where the best practice is to leave the soil undisturbed and protected, down to the worst case being landfill, was highlighted several times. So these findings were then taken into a period of co-development and refinement of the actual model policy text by our partners, led by our partners in Lancaster City Council and Cornwall Council, along with their expert teams in their planning offices. And I'm going to pass to John at this point to talk more about the actual model policy that was an output.
Great, thanks, Jess. Could you move me on to the next slide? Okay, so I'm going to say something about what the model policy contains, and as Jess mentioned earlier, you can read more about this in the local soils model policy and guide, which you can download from the Soil Task Force website. So the idea here was to produce some model text which would help planners integrate soil sustainability into their local plans. And we kind of focused on producing 2 sets of text. One which was around a focused soil management policy, and the other one was trying to then find text which could be used to cross-reference soils within other elements of those local plans. Let's move on to the next one, Jess. So I'm going to talk first about the principles of the model soil policy, and then I'll go on and talk a bit more about the cross-referencing in a moment. So the model soils policy really has kind of, I suppose, some principles. One being that we try and minimize any adverse effects. And then also trying to show that development can really facilitate a positive role for good soil management. And I think Jess in the previous talk highlighted that, particularly around the master planning and the benefits it can play in helping to sort of build thriving communities, deliver sustainable urban drainage, support biodiversity, food security, and also deliver good outcomes for carbon sequestration, climate mitigation, and resilience. So there's really, that kind of selling, I suppose, soils to developers and what they can, what benefits can be derived from taking them seriously. The other principle was around the presumption against the import or export of soils off the development site. So trying to use the soils on site, if they have to be disturbed, stockpiling them and reusing them rather than taking them off site. And where this is unavoidable, that any soil brought onto the site has to be responsibly sourced. And then the final point is around the submission of a soil management plan and strategy for all phases of construction. And I think Bruce picked up this as being something that Arcadis are trying to promote. And the kind of draft soils policy goes through many of the steps that Bruce outlined. So thinking about having a clear baseline that really understands the soils on the site and the functions that they can are performing and can continue to perform on the site. Thinking about how soils are used in construction, perhaps making use of this soil protection hierarchy around avoiding damage right through to looking after them while they're on site and remediating any damage that's done, leaving soils in situ where possible, being clear on how soils are stored and how they're going to be moved around the site, and then, as I mentioned earlier, where damage does occur, how that's going to be restored, and how those soil functions are going to be restored and enhanced following the end of the project. And that would be the final phase of the plan, which would be thinking about post-construction and how the soils are managed following the end of the project and into the future. Next slide, please, Jess. So that we have text there on soils themselves, and then the second set of sample texts are around cross-referencing soils within local plans, and we picked up on the kind of areas which were highlighted in our focus groups. So around water management, around the protection of the natural environment, and around carbon mitigation, sequestration, and net loss. And I'll very briefly go over those three areas for you now. So next slide. So water management, it was interesting chatting to Paul before we started. He was mentioning issues in his local area with stripping, compaction of subsoils, and the potential issues around water management that are likely to arise. And this is often highlighted, and if you Google this, you'll come up with a number of headlines from local papers. This is from the Liverpool Echo. So our draft policy is very much, I think, has a flood focus. I think perhaps had we been conducting our focus groups after this during the summer that we're experiencing at the moment, drought might have been an issue that might have come up, but we certainly flooding was something that many of the participants were concerned about, particularly the issue around inappropriate trafficking, storage and handling of soils on sites, causing problems with compaction, causing problems with infiltration, and then leading to flood issues post-development. Next one, Jess. Yeah, so the other one was around protection of the natural environment, and I think this was the kind of there was a big light went on in some of the people at certainly the workshop I was involved in, who really hadn't considered the ecological value of soils in their own right. And I think that, you know, the statistic that Jess had in her earlier slide, around 57% of the biodiversity being associated with soils that came out of this paper in PNAS, was, you know, a real kind of light bulb moment for many people in the workshop. So I think, you know, thinking about soils as part of the natural environment and ensuring that long-term protection of natural that the soils and the natural features that depend upon them on sites is something that's really important. And so we have text there that could be lifted and placed into that component of local plans. And then the final one is, wait for it, yeah, is carbon mitigation, sequestration, and net zero. And you know, this was highlighted again in our focus groups, and there was particular concern around areas of peatland and carbon-rich soils, so those kind of organo-mineral soils. And you know, even in our conversations with developers up in this part of the world, we know that developers are encountering these kinds of soils on sites which they didn't realize they were even there, and so that, you know, that there's a real need to avoid disturbing these soils if at all possible, and if not, to protect them and to really carefully manage the construction around them. And as you can see a picture here that's highlighted in an IUCN booklet around the development pressures on peatlands. Quite a shocking picture in Cheshire of encroachment on this SSSI. So we have some text there for planners to put into their local policies. Okay, so the next slide is really just to say about the next steps. We'd encourage you to visit the Soil Task Force website. All our reports are on there and you can download them. We're also obviously happy to have any questions on those if you want to get in touch. And please do share the model policy with as many planners as possible. We'd love to see it go more wider than Cornwall and Lancaster. And finally, of course, never treat soil like dirt, or as Bruce says, muck. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Jess and John. And what we're going to do now is open up the floor to questions. I think also the panelists themselves might have questions for each other. Remember, there's a question box. Please type in any questions that you have. I can still access some of those. Yeah, these talks were excellent. They really showed that, you know, the huge challenge we've got and also the potential positive impact we can have on construction by not treating soils like dirt or muck or whatever else you want to call them. But I'm going to start off with a slightly tricky question from Kirsty Charles, and it's aimed at Bruce and Jess. And it is, how do you go about working with clients who are not necessarily in favor of considering the importance of soils up front?
That's a great question. I should maybe let Jess answer that one. It's a really good question, and it's a fundamental issue. And again, we didn't, in our presentation and Jess's presentation, we didn't name projects. But, you know, we're currently working with one client who we've gone through, and that's maybe come back to a point around the sort of the policies in place and where they fit in. And we've come through a project where the client was really engaged, really good engagement around the impact assessment, around the soil management plan. We're now working with the contractor to implement it, and the contractor has got the red pen and strike through, not doing that, can't do that, that'll delay us, can't do that. And yeah, it's a process of just trying to educate, to maybe trying to see who can wear each other down the best to get to the solution. But I think also then we need these additional drivers. So we've got the sort of involving guidance. The DEFRA code is the sort of an absolute critical linchpin to all that. But the more we can get into local policy, the more developers are required to answer the question that is set by policy, whether local or national, I think the better and the easier that problem will be.
Okay, excellent. Anything else, Jess? Oh, okay. I'm going to go over to another broad one. This is from Willie Towers. Is the soil science community ready for the ambitious house building program of the Labour government? We clearly have. Sorry, this is now. Where's it gone to? Okay, there we go. We clearly have a huge potential role in all the phases lined out by Bruce, if the politics allows. I want to throw that actually at the academics first, and then go back to Bruce and Jess on it. So the other Jess from Lancaster, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure we're ready. I think there's a growing awareness and interest, isn't it? But it's not been a traditionally large part of soil science academia research into the impacts of construction and development compared to agriculture and natural ecosystems. Yeah, maybe perhaps John wants to say more, but something I was thinking about as well is this skills gap. That if we want to put good practice into the whole process, it's going to require qualified soil scientists, ecologists to be engaged in those projects, and be interested in Jess and Bruce's view as well, and yours, Paula, is the broader community ready to provide those expertise?
Yeah, I thought this was a really interesting question from Willie here. I think there's, from an academic perspective, I think there's so many questions that we just don't know the answers to, Paul, in this area at the moment. And it's largely been the domain of engineers, who think about how compressive soils are and how deep the foundations need to go and such like. And I think there is a need for soil scientists to start getting involved. This is huge. As people have put up these numbers, it's a frightening amount of soil that's being damaged here or lost, and we need to get engaged with it. And I think there's so many opportunities in research, but also in education, and how we get soils embedded into civil work and civil engineers, and how we educate. It's not just the engineers; it's also the digger drivers and everybody else on site as well, who we need to try and educate and promote soils too. So I think there's loads of work to be done in this area from an academic perspective, and I'm sure there's probably plenty of work for Bruce and Jess as well, and their colleagues in the commercial side as well.
I think the point you touched on there, John, around sort of the engineering side of things, and I've spoken about this before, that there's a language, there's a terminology issue. We talk about soil, and we talk about soil as the living bit at the top that's really important. Whereas I can get drawn into conversations because soil's in the question, but it's a deep dig, down tens of meters, but they're calling it soil. But saying that, there's also then, I think we as a community need to be open to bringing other people in. And I think ecologists and others have been mentioned. There are some really fantastic people who spend their lives supervising construction works on site from an environmental perspective, and I think we've got an easy way in there to upskill those, which I don't think is a difficult task, to start thinking about the soil questions, what they should be looking for on site. And myself and Jess have got some great experience working with some of our colleagues who traditionally come from a sort of contaminated land background, but doing a lot of site work, who can very, very quickly pick up these concepts and do some really great work on site in terms of sort of flagging issues, working with contractors and so on. So I think the soil science community is not big enough, and we've got a long way to go to sort of match even where we need to be today. But there are others out there who I think who can help us, particularly in that sort of site supervision aspect.
Great, thanks everyone. Yeah, and from my perspective, I think we have a risk going forward of training provision in soil science. That universities are struggling right now, and a lot of specialist courses are under threat, and soils are one of them actually. Um, I'm just going to keep along this line of questions regarding policies and implementation. And then there's some much more specific questions people have asked, including about practical implementation. So have you come across problems in the planning system? So basically, planners not requiring agricultural land classification and soil resource surveys, and even if done, not taking the results into account through a lack of understanding of their importance. And this is going to be aimed at Bruce and Jess.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in there and do chip in as well, Jess, if you got something to add as well. Yes, I think there's. Sorry, yeah, I was trying to work out how to answer that question succinctly. Yes, I think there are issues, and again, this comes back to the skills gap. So not all, but some local authorities have their own ecologists in house, their own other specialists. I'm not aware of any, and I'm love to be known I'm wrong here, but who've got people, councils have got soils experience in it, and very often we will see we'll submit documents and they'll go to review, and the reviewing comments back are, I've had a look through, but it's not my speciality, I'm a waste specialist. But that's the skills that council had in place. So it is a problem. I think there's perhaps not so much in terms of the requirement for ALCs and soil resources survey, but I think it's that, okay, well, what do we do with that? If how strongly do we push asking for it? When we get it, what does it mean? What do we do with it? And again, I think this is part of that skills gap and part of that broadening that understanding and knowledge of the questions to ask, why these things should be done, and also then trying to move that into, okay, well, we now need to sort of drive and police this as projects progress.
Yeah, I recently had a conversation with someone from another consultancy where they were saying that this project they were working on was the first one that they've worked on where agriculture and soils were considered to the extent it has been. Because historically they'd been working on projects where it had been scoped out from the beginning. So historically that may have been the approach, and stuff is starting to change. But for some people, that might still have been the mentality or the understanding of how this aspect, this technical aspect, is being considered. So whilst it is changing, there are some people who may still not realise the level of consideration needed.
Did you notice in that, Jess, whether people's mentality was changing as well? So greater appreciation.
I think when you start to have the conversations and they realise kind of how wide influencing kind of the impacts on the soils can be. I think sometimes when I've worked on construction sites, though, the main way that you can get people to listen is when you kind of highlight the health and safety aspect, the programme aspects. Obviously, kind of soils have their own integral value, but kind of putting it into the language that is understood on the construction sites, the fact that that machinery won't be able to move, or that people are more at risk of injury if you're trying to track across soil that's now turned to slurry and people are sinking up to their knees, that there are ways to get the information out there in a way that all of these different disciplines can understand in the context of actually what they're used to working in.
Excellent. I'm going to go over to probably the final question because we're running out of time here. It's to Jess and John, and it's quite a general question on how is your work going to be publicized and communicated more widely beyond the councils that you worked with?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We've been working with the, engaging with the Royal Town Planning Institute in the project itself, and we're going to reconnect with those at the end of the project now, so that's a good forum. But really, our partners in Lancaster and Cornwall are great advocates and pushing the message out as well through their networks and conferences, and yeah, that if other people have other ideas, we'd love to hear them, because yeah, we're really keen that people pick this up and it gets used.
Yeah, excellent. So I'm going to have to close it there, but there are some really, really good questions that are sitting in the question box that aren't answered. Everything from measuring carbon emissions from disturbing land through to how to provide training to people in areas of land contamination, just basically so that the clients are more up to speed. So there are a lot of things. Please contact the speakers directly with some of the questions as well. But on behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, I want to just say thank you very much to Bruce Lascelles, Jess Potts, John Quinton, and Jess Davies for coming along to present today. It was a great session, I think, that brought together the actual implementation with some of the research work behind it and showing a lot of the challenges that we've got going forwards with construction, but also the huge advantage of doing soils work properly to ensure protection. So thanks everyone for attending. There's going to be a feedback survey at the end of the webinar, so please take some time to complete this. We've recorded the webinar and it's going to be put up on our YouTube channel. So if you know anyone who's missed it, you can point them in that direction. And we also have our conferences coming up in December. So this is both the Early Careers Conference, which will take place from the 1st to 2nd December in Manchester, and also the main conference or annual conference that's being held from the 3rd to the 5th of December, also in Manchester, with the theme Resilient Soils for a Sustainable Future. So both of these are open for abstracts. Please submit and please try to attend. Our last conference in Wales had our greatest attendance ever of any of our annual meetings. So the next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, 27th of August, and it will be focusing on long-term experiments, and it's to be led by the Ecological Continuity Trust. And also keep an eye on our website for any future events and any emails that we'll have as well with more details. So hopefully we'll see you at many future events, but in the meantime, thank you and goodbye.